Freud's forgotten theory that explains every modern addiction. Why do we keep reaching for the phone, the drink, the click, the rush, even when it hurts us? Modern life is an endless buffet of pleasures, yet we've never been more restless, anxious, and addicted. Sigmund Freud, more than a century ago, predicted this exact crisis, and he offered an explanation so profound that most of modern psychology has quietly buried it. Freud believed that every addiction, from drugs to ambition, from scrolling to sex, begins with one thing: the unbearable tension between our instincts and our civilization. He called it the repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to repeat pain in the hope of mastering it, to seek pleasure not because it fulfills us, but because it momentarily silences our inner conflict. This forgotten theory doesn't just explain cocaine or nicotine, it explains the addiction to validation, success, outrage, the invisible chains that bind the modern soul. In this exploration, we'll uncover how Freud's deepest insights, once dismissed as outdated, may hold the key to understanding why humanity, in its pursuit of freedom, has become enslaved to desire. Because to heal addiction, Freud believed, we must first understand what we're truly trying to escape: ourselves. Part 1. The Age of Desire, Freud and the Birth of the Addicted Self. There was a moment in history when desire became infinite. It was not when humanity invented pleasure, but when it discovered that pleasure could be manufactured, multiplied, and consumed without end. The 19th century birthed machines that could move faster than horses, factories that could produce more than hands, and cities that could crowd more souls than any village could dream. And in the midst of this industrial hum, a physician in Vienna began to listen. To the murmurs of nervous women, to the silences of men who could not sleep, to the symptoms that spoke what mouths could not. His name was Sigmund Freud, and what he heard was not just the sound of illness. It was the first whisper of the modern addiction. Freud's patients were not addicts in the way we use the word today. They were not chained to opioids or screens, but to compulsions of another kind: hysterical paralysis, obsessive washing, uncontrollable fears. He realized that beneath every symptom was a story the conscious mind refused to tell. Repression was the body's secret language, and craving, whether for touch, for power, or for escape, was its dialect. The more society demanded restraint, the more desire sought forbidden doors. Thus was born the paradox of the civilized self: outwardly composed, inwardly burning. The modern world promised liberation. Science would free us from ignorance, reason would free us from superstition, industry would free us from poverty. Yet as Freud watched the rise of the city, he saw a new slavery forming, one not of chains but of appetite. The human being, once guided by instinct, now lived under an empire of norms. To belong, one had to repress. To function, one had to obey. But instincts do not vanish when silenced. They retreat underground, growing stronger in the dark, until they return disguised as obsession, as anxiety, as craving. Civilization, Freud wrote, is built on the renunciation of instinct, and every renunciation leaves behind a wound. What Freud glimpsed was that addiction is not a moral failure, nor even a disease in the medical sense. It is a symptom of the human condition itself, intensified by the pressures of modern life. The more we repress our primal drives, our longing for love, our fear of death, our hunger for meaning, the more those drives mutate into compulsions. The addict, in Freud's eyes, was not merely weak, he was honest. He displayed in the open what everyone else concealed. In his trembling hands and restless nights lay the confession of civilization's secret, that we are all craving something we cannot name. Freud's early theory of the psyche divided the self into three warring forces: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is the chaos of instinct, the eternal child crying for satisfaction. The superego is the voice of law and morality, the stern parent watching from within. The ego is the fragile negotiator trying to please both. In this fragile balance, addiction erupts when the ego collapses under the tension. The pleasure demanded by the id and the prohibition imposed by the superego become unbearable. The psyche, desperate for relief, seeks repetition, another drink, another scroll, another surge of dopamine to restore a fleeting equilibrium. but each repetition strengthens the chain. Freud called this the repetition compulsion, the mind's strange urge to replay pain in search of mastery. A traumatized child grows into an adult who unconsciously reenacts the same wounds, choosing lovers or habits that recreate the original hurt. The repetition is not joy, it is ritual. It is the psyche's attempt to rewrite history through action. Addiction, in this sense, is the theater of the unconscious, a performance in which the actor keeps reenacting the same tragedy, hoping for a different ending. To the rational eye, this is madness. Why would anyone chase what destroys them? But Freud saw that pleasure and pain are not opposites. They are twins. The act that soothes also punishes. Every craving carries within it a dose of guilt, and that guilt becomes the secret satisfaction of the act. This is why the addict's remorse feels almost sacred. It completes the cycle, giving the illusion of moral balance. The cigarette after failure, the drink after shame, the endless scrolling after loneliness. Each is a tiny ceremony of both indulgence and self-condemnation. The addict does not seek happiness. He seeks relief from the war within. When Freud turned his gaze outward to civilization itself, he realized that this inner war is mirrored in society. The industrial world, like the psyche, runs on repression and release. The factory represses the worker's individuality. The market offers commodities as substitute desires. Consumption becomes the socially acceptable outlet for instinct. We no longer scream, we shop, we no longer fight, we compete. Every commercial promise, buy this, feel alive again, is a miniature psychoanalysis, translating unconscious hunger into economic demand. In this way, capitalism becomes a collective unconscious of humanity, shaping our desires while pretending to satisfy them. Freud's insight, forgotten amid the progress of neuroscience, was that addiction is not about the substance, but the structure of desire itself. What we call addictive is simply the most visible form of a universal pattern. The gambler, the workaholic, the influencer refreshing likes. They all participate in the same dance. Repression, craving, release, guilt, repetition. The object changes. The structure remains. We are addicted not to things, but to the process of escaping the self. Each high is a momentary amnesia, a brief vacation from the burden of consciousness. He saw this clearly during his studies of hysteria. His patients' symptoms often disappeared when they spoke the truth of their pain, a discovery that gave birth to psychoanalysis. The cure was not chemical, but narrative. When the repressed memory surfaced into words, the body no longer needed to express it through illness. This was the first crack in the wall of silence that addiction builds. To speak one's truth, to make the unconscious conscious, is to break the cycle of repetition, yet few dare to do it. For most, it is easier to reach for the bottle or the phone than to face the abyss of meaninglessness. Freud lived in an age that worshiped progress, yet he was its reluctant prophet. He saw that the same forces liberating humanity were also fragmenting it. The machine that conquered nature also conquered attention. The city that expanded opportunity also multiplied isolation. The individual, once bound to family and tradition, now floated in a sea of stimuli, searching for anchor. Desire, once guided by necessity, now roamed free, unattached to purpose. And when desire loses its object, it becomes addiction. The pleasure principle, Freud's cornerstone idea, states that the mind seeks pleasure and avoids pain. But he later discovered that this principle alone could not explain the darker tendencies of the human soul. Why did soldiers dream of their traumas? Why did people sabotage their happiness? There was another force at work, something beyond the pursuit of pleasure. He called it the death drive, or thanatos, the instinct to return to stillness, to end tension, to dissolve back into nothingness. The addict, Freud realized, embodies both drives at once. He chases life to the edge of death, seeking in excess the silence he cannot find in moderation. Each act of consumption is a small rehearsal for oblivion. Modern science often treats addiction as a chemical misfire, a neurobiological error. Freud would nod, but only partially agree. To him, the chemical is merely the messenger. The message lies deeper. It is the psyche itself that craves dissolution, because consciousness is heavy. To live is to bear awareness, to feel loss, fear, and longing. Every intoxication, from alcohol to algorithms, promises temporary amnesia. It is a return to the womb, to the preconscious state where pain cannot reach. Freud called this the oceanic feeling, a sense of unity and release that religion, love, and intoxication all share. The addict's tragedy is not that he seeks too much pleasure, but that he seeks to escape the burden of being human. Freud's Vienna was the first mirror of our own digital era. Behind the decorum of high society, there was nervous exhaustion, moral fatigue, and the birth of what he called discontent. Today, the drawing rooms are gone, replaced by screens, but the symptoms remain. Our nervous system is overstimulated, our instincts starved, our loneliness monetized. We scroll not because we care, but because stopping feels like dying. Each notification is a miniature promise of meaning. Each swipe is a repetition compulsion. Civilization has perfected the machinery of desire, and the human spirit is its raw material. For Freud, the solution was not abstinence, but awareness. One cannot destroy desire, one can only understand it. The aim of psychoanalysis was never to make life painless, but to replace neurotic suffering with ordinary unhappiness, a state in which one lives consciously, not compulsively. In that modest goal lies profound wisdom. Addiction is not cured by willpower, but by knowledge of self. The moment we name our craving, it begins to lose its power. What was unconscious becomes visible, and visibility is liberation. The age of desire, as Freud foresaw, is an age of mirrors. We live surrounded by reflections of who we wish to be, each promising to complete us. But behind every reflection stands the same emptiness Freud heard in his consulting room, the hollow echo of repression. The addict is simply the one who listens too closely to that echo and tries to fill it. The rest of us drown it out with distractions and call it life. Part 2, the machinery of craving, psychology of addiction, and the inner prison. If Freud's first discovery was that desire drives us, his second was that desire can enslave us. The same energy that animates life, that pulls the child to the mother and the lover to the beloved, can also turn inward and become a prison. For the modern soul, this paradox defines existence. To live is to crave, and to crave is to suffer. The addict, in Freud's sense, is not an exception, but an exaggeration, the mirror in which we all see the truth that our own hunger never ends. In the quiet of his Viennese consulting room, Freud began to map this machinery of craving. He saw the psyche not as a battlefield of good and evil, but as a dynamic system of forces. Every thought, every gesture, every hesitation was a trace of energy moving between poles, repression and release, pleasure and pain. The modern person, surrounded by choices, believes he is free. Yet under the surface, ancient drives are directing the play. What we call willpower is often only the ego's desperate effort to control tides that rise from depths it barely understands. Addiction, Freud realized, reveals the architecture of the human mind more clearly than sanity ever could. It exposes the invisible gears of repetition, the feedback loop between desire and guilt. The more we try to suppress an impulse, the stronger it becomes. The more we indulge it, the more it enslaves us. Civilization itself runs on this paradox. The law forbids, and the forbidden becomes sacred. The more society demands self-control, the more the unconscious dreams of surrender. It is not pleasure that addicts us, but the oscillation between restraint and release. The delicious tension of almost losing control, then reclaiming it, then losing it again. Freud called this the pleasure principle at war with the reality principle. The pleasure principle seeks immediate satisfaction, the baby's cry for milk, the lover's longing for touch. The reality principle learns delay, compromise, frustration. Growing up, Freud said, is the process of replacing instinct with postponement. But in the cracks of that postponement, desire grows restless. It whispers that life should not be endured, but consumed. When the tension becomes unbearable, the psyche rebels. It seeks shortcuts to ecstasy. Addiction is that rebellion institutionalized, the ego's failed negotiation with the ID. The more the ego resists the id's demands, the more cunning the unconscious becomes. Freud compared it to a trickster. If it cannot have what it wants openly, it will find substitutes, symptoms, diversions. The alcoholic may tell himself he only drinks to relax, the workaholic that he loves productivity, the social media addict that he is staying informed. The rationalization is not a lie, but a defense mechanism. The ego cannot admit that it is powerless before pleasure, so it invents stories that preserve the illusion of control. Beneath those stories, however, the old hunger keeps moving, mechanical and impersonal, like the pulse of the universe itself. The modern world amplifies this inner machinery until it becomes an external system, an economy built on compulsion. Algorithms read our desires more accurately than we can. Corporations package fantasy into habit. We scroll, not because the content matters, but because the gesture itself satisfies a deeper rhythm. Freud would have called it autoerotic, the pleasure of self-stimulation, detached from any object. The act becomes its own end, a perpetual loop of arousal and emptiness. This is why every addict, no matter the substance, describes the same void afterward. What they seek is not the object, but the movement toward it, the pulse of desire itself. Freud's clinical genius lay in understanding that repression and craving are twins. Every civilization demands that certain instincts be repressed: aggression, sexuality, dependency. But repressed energy does not vanish. It returns in distorted forms. The man who cannot express anger at his boss becomes addicted to violent video games. The woman taught to fear her body becomes obsessed with dieting. The lonely youth denied tenderness seeks it through anonymous pixels. The symptom is not random, it is symbolic communication. Addiction speaks in metaphor. It tells the story the conscious mind refuses to tell. Inside this machinery of craving lies another mechanism: guilt. Freud saw guilt as civilization's hidden engine. To keep people obedient, society installs a moral overseer inside the psyche, the superego. This inner judge monitors thought and impulse, punishing deviation with shame. The addict feels this punishment acutely. After the binge comes the remorse. After indulgence, the self-loathing. Yet that guilt does not cure, it feeds the cycle. The more one feels unworthy, the more one seeks relief through the very act that caused the guilt. Thus, addiction becomes self-sustaining. Pain creates desire. Desire creates pain. The superego and the id, enemies in theory, become partners in destruction. Freud's darker insight was that human beings may, in fact, need this cycle. We are not built for unbroken happiness. We crave tension, struggle, the drama of failure and redemption. The pleasure of breaking a rule derives its sweetness from the rule itself. Remove prohibition, and desire collapses. This explains why those who can have everything often fall into deeper boredom and addiction. When nothing is forbidden, nothing is meaningful. The addict therefore manufactures his own hell, creating a rule only to break it, seeking the ecstasy of transgression. In his relapse lies a perverse freedom, a momentary escape from the tyranny of the superego. Freud's patients often confess dreams of repetition, walking the same corridors, reliving the same scenes. He saw these not as meaningless, but as the psyche's attempt to resolve what consciousness could not. Trauma demands repetition. It insists on being reenacted until it is understood. Addiction, in this sense, is a trauma loop, a ritual of forgetting and remembering. Each hit, each click, each drink is an unconscious attempt to revisit an original wound. The first abandonment, the first rejection, the first taste of helplessness. The addict returns to pain because pain is familiar, and familiarity feels safe. To break the cycle, Freud said, one must bring the unconscious into speech. The patient must speak the truth he has been avoiding, not to confess sin, but to transform repetition into narrative. When the story is told, the compulsion loses its script, but modern culture has no patience for introspection. We treat addiction with slogans and substitutions, nicotine patches, dopamine detoxes, productivity hacks. We cure the symptom without touching the soul. Freud would have called this a displacement, the shifting of energy from one object to another, leaving the structure intact. The addiction disappears only to reappear in a new form. The sober man who becomes addicted to religion, the recovered smoker who obsesses over fitness, the detoxed influencer who worships purity. The machinery remains, only the decoration changes. This is the tragedy of our time. We have medicalized craving but not understood it. The pharmaceutical era reduces desire to neurotransmitters, ignoring its meaning. But Freud knew that the psyche is symbolic. Every act, even self-destruction, speaks of a wish. The addict's wish is not for pleasure, but for peace, to silence the conflict between what he is and what he is supposed to be. Civilization intensifies this conflict to a breaking point. It tells us to be ambitious but humble, sensual but pure, expressive but disciplined. The modern human being is a contradiction dressed in clothes. An addiction becomes the body's rebellion against impossible ideals. Freud's metaphor for this was striking. He compared the ego to a man riding a horse. The horse is the id, powerful, blind, and instinctive. The rider is reason, holding the reins, but always at risk of being thrown off. The modern rider believes he is in control because the horse moves where he wishes, but he forgets that the horse chooses the path, the pace, and the destination. Addiction begins when the rider's arms grow tired. He loosens the reins, and for a moment, the ride feels ecstatic. Freedom mistaken for control. Only later does he realize he is galloping toward the abyss. What makes the inner prison so cruel is that its walls are invisible. The addict believes he acts freely. Each time he swears, "This is the last time," he feels moral victory, as if the decision were his. Freud saw this self-deception not as weakness, but as the mind's survival strategy. To live fully conscious of one's powerlessness would be unbearable. So the ego constructs illusions. I can quit when I want. It's not that bad. I deserve this. These are not lies but anesthetics, tiny doses of denial that keep the psyche from imploding. In Freud's view, neurosis itself is a form of anesthesia, a way to keep unbearable truth at bay. The true cage, then, is not the craving, but the refusal to see it. Freud's analysis offered no simple redemption. He did not promise that awareness would erase desire, only that it would make us less enslaved by it. The goal of psychoanalysis was not purity, but honesty. To know one's drives, to see one's own machinery, to accept the inevitability of imperfection. In this humble acceptance lies a strange liberation. The man who admits his dependence is freer than the one who denies it. Awareness turns the compulsion into choice, even if the choice is to fail again tomorrow. As the century unfolded, Freud's insights were diluted by optimism. Behaviorism promised conditioning, pharmacology promised cures, technology promised distraction. Yet beneath the progress, the same pattern persisted. We became more efficient, more connected, more entertained, and more dependent. The machinery of craving migrated from the unconscious into the marketplace, from the patient's dream into the data stream. What Freud glimpsed in his patient's obsessions became the architecture of the internet itself, a system designed to keep desire unsatisfied, to feed on the repetition compulsion. Civilization, once the cure for chaos, had become the addict's supplier. 3. Beyond the pleasure principle. Healing, freedom, and the search for the real. Freud once said that every discovery in his life began as a confession. When he wrote Beyond the Pleasure Principle in 1920, Europe was bleeding from the First World War, and Freud himself was watching the slow collapse of everything he had believed about the human spirit. He had built his theory of mind on the conviction that people sought pleasure and avoided pain. Now, surrounded by the wreckage of civilization, he saw something darker, the repeated, almost ritualistic return to destruction. Humanity seemed addicted to its own suffering. He realized that behind the pleasure principle lurked another law, the urge not to live, but to return to stillness, to repeat pain until it consumed itself. He called it the death drive. This was not the melodramatic death of literature, nor the suicide of despair. It was a cosmic tendency toward quiet, the pull back to the inorganic, the wish to undo tension. Every living organism, Freud said, carries within it the memory of rest, of non-being. We crave excitement and sensation only to exhaust ourselves into silence. Addiction in this sense is a miniature enactment of the death drive, the search for annihilation disguised as pleasure. The drunk who drinks to forget, the addict who uses until blackout, the overworker who collapses, each is obeying an ancient instinct to end the burden of awareness. For Freud, this insight was terrifying but liberating. It meant that healing could never be achieved by chasing more pleasure. True freedom required confronting the death drive, looking directly at the impulse to self-erase, and learning to live with it consciously. Only by facing the desire for nothingness could one begin to choose life. In this reversal lay the seed of all later existential and humanistic psychology. The modern world, however, has built its identity on denial of death. We speak of progress, longevity, wellness, optimization, words designed to make mortality feel optional. The marketplace turns fear into consumption, anti-aging creams, digital afterlives, the cult of endless productivity. Yet the more we run from death, the more it infiltrates our behavior. The endless scrolling, the binge watching, the overwork, the self-punishment, all these are quiet rehearsals for oblivion. We simulate death through distraction, hoping that if we numb ourselves enough, we might forget the truth of finitude. Freud would recognize this as the collective neurosis of the 21st century. But if the death drive is real, what does healing look like? Freud's answer was deceptively simple. Make the unconscious conscious. Bring the drive into the light, and it loses its tyranny. The goal is not to destroy the instinct, but to integrate it, to see death as part of life's rhythm rather than its enemy. When the patient speaks his trauma, when he gives words to the compulsion, he transforms a blind repetition into meaning. Through understanding, the loop begins to open. Here Freud touches something almost spiritual. To live beyond the pleasure principle is to accept that pleasure and pain are not opposites but partners. Every joy contains loss. Every satisfaction fades. The mature psyche does not cling to ecstasy nor flee from suffering. It allows both to flow through. In that flow arises a new kind of happiness, not the fever of gratification, but the calm of truth. Modern therapy often translates this insight into the language of mindfulness, presence, or acceptance. Yet Freud's original vision was more radical. He was not promising serenity, but awakening. To heal is to dismantle illusion, to see oneself without anesthesia. The analyst's couch was a confessional without religion, a place where one could name the gods of one's own making and watch them dissolve. When a patient recognized that his compulsions were choices, his symptoms messages, his guilt inherited rather than earned, he began to live consciously. Awareness did not erase pain, but it transformed it into participation in reality. Freud's later writings became increasingly metaphysical. He spoke of eros and thanatos, the twin forces of life and death dancing through everything that exists. Eros builds, binds, creates. Thanatos unravels, releases, returns. The human tragedy arises when these forces fall out of balance. Addiction, in Freud's terms, is eros enslaved by thanatos. The life drive turned against itself, using pleasure as a weapon of destruction. Healing, therefore, is not abstinence alone. It is reconciliation. It is learning to let desire breathe without letting it devour. Imagine a world that took this seriously. Instead of pathologizing craving, we would treat it as a language of the soul. Instead of punishing addicts, we would listen to what their repetition is trying to say. We would ask, what forgotten wound is being reenacted here? What loss demands to be seen? Each act of excess would be read as a cry for integration. Such a view requires compassion, the courage to witness darkness without recoiling. Freud's clinical detachment was, at its core, a discipline of empathy. To look at humanity's most shameful impulses and say, this too is part of us. The search for the real begins here, where illusion collapses. For centuries, philosophy sought truth in ideas. Religion sought it in revelation, science in observation. Freud placed it inside the fracture of the self. The real is what resists fantasy, the raw pulse that remains when every story about ourselves is stripped away. Addiction, anxiety, obsession, these are signals that the psyche's stories no longer fit the truth of experience. Healing means daring to live without the old narrative, to stand in the open field of uncertainty. To go beyond the pleasure principle is, therefore, to outgrow childish consolation. It is to realize that happiness is not a permanent state, but a rhythm, like breathing. We inhale joy, exhale loss, inhale hope, exhale despair. The goal is not to hold the breath of pleasure, but to keep breathing through the whole of existence. When Freud wrote of "where it was, ego shall be," he envisioned this movement, consciousness expanding into the dark regions of instinct, bringing light not to banish shadow, but to coexist with it. The deeper paradox is that once we stop fleeing suffering, it changes shape. What once felt like punishment becomes participation. Pain becomes a signal of depth, a reminder that we are alive. The addict who learns to sit with craving discovers that behind it lies not death but desire for connection, expression, belonging. The death drive, when faced, turns into gratitude, the recognition that life is precious precisely because it ends. In Freud's private notes, he once wrote, "We are healed by becoming what we are." That sentence could stand as the entire philosophy of psychoanalysis. Healing is not transformation into someone else. It is the recovery of authenticity. When a person ceases to pretend, when he accepts the contradiction of being both saint and animal, creator and destroyer, he steps beyond compulsion. Freedom is not the absence of drives, but the art of living with them consciously. This is where Freud, without meaning to, joined the great mystics. Like Buddha, he saw that craving causes suffering. Like Kierkegaard, he believed that despair could become a doorway to faith. Not faith in dogma, but faith in existence itself. And like Dostoevsky, he knew that redemption arises not from perfection, but from truth. To face one's demons is to invite grace. As we move deeper into the 21st century, Freud's forgotten insight grows urgent. Our technologies have externalized the unconscious. The algorithm is the new ID, relentless, seductive, blind morality. It feeds us what we desire until we collapse from excess. To live freely in such a world requires inner work of an ancient kind. One must learn to watch desire without obeying it, to engage pleasure without being devoured. This is not repression, but awareness, the art of staying awake in the storm.